Okay, I think we're live, everyone. So we'll just give this just another minute or two for people to settle in, but the debate we were having before is just who is and isn't wearing a hat right now, since 2/3 of us are. So in the chat, who's wearing a hat?
The most important question.
Yeah.
That's right, even though we can't see you.
Yes, well, we will have to take your word.
You could just lie. It's okay.
We'll give it one more minute, and then we can see people adding in. So, all right, let's get this started. So, hello, thank you all for coming today. This is a really exciting presentation. So this is how we use AI to get to yes and no 2 times faster at Dagster. I'm Dennis. I'm a developer advocate at Dagster, and I'll mostly just be handing this off to Christian, who leads sales engineering at Dagster and is our expert on putting together demos, and he'll be doing one live, which is going to be very exciting. We also have Colton, who, if you've been to our webinars in the past, you'll probably recognize him. So Colton's a software engineer who has worked on a lot of the AI features and some of the AI skills that are going to get talked about. So he's got a very deep knowledge of just these workflows and kind of how to optimize these. And he'll help in the chat and just help answer any questions. So really, as things come up and there's anything you're curious about, please ask and we'll try and answer it. But like I said, I got my headshot included on this webinar, but I'm going to be contributing the least. So I'm going to just pass it over to Christian.
All right. Thanks, Dennis. I will I'll share my screen and I will pull this up and we'll get this started. Cool. All right. So like Dennis said, I'm Christian. I lead our sales engineering team here at Dagster. And I'm gonna, do the thing that you're not supposed to do, which is like a live demo. So we're gonna talk about that. But before I get there, this is just like a roadmap of where we're headed. So we're gonna start at the end. I'm gonna tell you the conclusion, which was already in the title of the talk, which is the numbers that we got to. Then we're gonna pause, and I'm gonna ask you all for your input. So I'm gonna ask you to put things in the chat about what you want to see, for, like, in terms of a data platform that we'll build. Then we'll take a step back and we'll talk about, like, why do we demo in sales? What's the purpose? Why would we want to do a custom demo? What makes Dagster so good at building custom demos with AI? Some examples of how we did things with Gen AI at Dagster. I think this space is moving really fast, and so it can be kind of nice to just sort of see how that goes. Then we'll talk about the current system, and then we're gonna see what, while we were talking and doing things, we're gonna see what the robot came up with. So start at the end. We cut our sales time, like the time from the initial sales call to the start of a POC, roughly in half after we kicked off and kind of implemented this custom demo workflow. And so, why is that important? That is important because one, like, the thing that kills deals the most is time. So like, if that's just like a big important thing. Also, it matters, like, in terms of throughput. Like if we have sales folks and sales engineers actively working on deals that aren't going to go anywhere and spending a bunch of time on them, that is not great. The other thing is, it's also not great for the prospect, right? Like if we are engaged in a long proof of concept cycle, or we are engaged in a long kind of just overall sales cycle, that's also time that, like, the prospects are spending thinking about Dagster and things like that, even if they end up saying no, right? And so that's also another reason. And so one thing I just wanted to call out on this slide is we actually did not just cut off, like, time kind of time to close one or time to starting a POC. We also cut the time of starting off at the beginning of kind of the beginning of a sales cycle to when people said no, roughly in half as well. Very similar magnitude of effects, and that's really important because again, that's like time that the folks who were able to see, say no, Dagster's not actually what we need. They were able to make that decision much sooner, and they didn't have to think about it. And so basically, that's kind of the TLDR, or like the what we did. This is what we did. So let's make it fun. What we're gonna do is put in the chat what you want to see in the demo. So like what you'd want to see, and when I say that, I mean like what is the data platform stack? What are the tools and technologies that you would want to see integrated into Dagster? And it's okay if it's kind of a Frankenstein's monster of things, because this could be a diverse group using lots of different things. But just put some things in the chat about some kind of data ingestion, some kind of data transformation, maybe reverse ETL, maybe probably some kind of monitoring tools, automation. Okay, that's great. What else we got? Okay, a stitch integration. Love it. DBT, classic, yes. We want to do an incremental ETL from a complicated API with parallel processing. Okay, love that. Data that's in Parquet. It's fantastic. For automation, I'm assuming that might mean like complex schedules and sensors, kind of like either things on a schedule or things that are the monitoring, but feel free to add to that. Okay, DLT, fantastic. Okay, great. So let us begin. This thing. So I'm gonna stop sharing this window. I'm gonna share. Let me see. Let me pull up my terminal, and I will boot a fresh Claude Code session. Here we go. All right. Got this guy up. Great. Okay, so we're gonna boot Claude, and so let's do it. I have, and we're gonna talk about the setup of this. So I'm just gonna kind of do it, and you're gonna just see me literally type, which is gonna be super fun. Okay, so let's see. Make a Dagster demo project that ingests a complicated API using, we'll say using Stitch. Let's see, using an incremental pattern and partitions, transform the data in using DBT, also demonstrate DLT pulling some other API data via DLT. Let's see, what else? Let's see, create a Parquet file reverse ETL destination. So we do something like that. Let's see. Why not use Opus? Yeah, so this is just Sonnet 5. So I basically just said like whatever the default is, I'm just gonna do it. So this is the default there. So that's a great question. Let's see, but I could switch to Opus 4.8. I think I tested this out yesterday and it worked just fine with Sonnet 5. So your mileage may vary. Okay, make sure. Oh, I'm gonna throw Monkey Engineer. Nobody said this, but I think this is cool. So I'm also gonna say like to do like some kind of legacy system. So I'm gonna say like also create an integration with Informatica Cloud, which some of you may know and love. Create an integration with Informatica Cloud that both observes and executes as I am migrating away from Informatica Cloud to DLT and DBT. Cool. Let's see. Also, like, be sure to add some sensor-based checks or some sensors and schedule-based automation and some asset checks. Yeah. And let's see, what else? Anything else? Any other? I think I'm going to skip RAG only because, we could do that another time. And I have a great example for you if that would be useful. Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna kick this guy off, and he's gonna be running in the background while we do the rest of the talk. So fantastic, cool. Okay, let me stop sharing that screen, and we're gonna start sharing back on the presentation. Cool. All right. So that's gonna be very cool, and we'll let that churn away. So why do we do demos in the first place? Like, what is the point? So just to take a step back, right? We're talking mostly about Dagster and Dagster projects, but it can kind of help to frame like what is the business problem that we're actually trying to solve here. So demos are a way of helping someone who is interested in a product to like see the value of the product. Now, what's important about that is it's not so much about them seeing like the features and functionality, right? Like, I mean, that's useful, but those are only useful if they like do something for people. Like, so what? Who cares, right? So like, what is the purpose? Who cares about that thing? So for example, you would need to know something like, what is not working today in your current setup, right? Like, why change something if everything's working great? Like, don't change it, right? So examples might be like people spending too much time debugging errors. Examples might be, people are maybe consolidating on a single vendor for their data stack, but the migration is taking a long time. That kind of thing. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were like, we're standardizing on a single vendor for like our entire data platform. And I said, that's great. And I said, how's that migration going? And they said, well, it should be done in about 6 months. And I said, how long has it been almost done for 6 months? And they said for about 3 years. And I don't know, that spoke to me because I've lived that. Anyway, so, then we're going to show like how does it actually solve someone's problem? So we can't obviously show, hey, how this is going to solve everything, or actually, implement a real solution that's going to do something in production. But what we can do is help them understand and get a visualization of like how this product might solve their pain points, and give them enough confidence to be able to like move to the next step, which would be like a proof of concept step. And so, why is that? Previously what we had done before this, we had like a standard demo, which was, using the stack that the majority of people were using. So like it was on Snowflake, it was on DBT. We had examples of ingesting data with Sling. We had sensor-based automations, and we had some Databricks jobs, and we had some, some jobs that would kick off Kubernetes jobs. And we had, we kept on adding to that kind of, it's not static in the sense of, a standard demo, because it does update live. It's a very cool product. It's actually open source. It's out there. If you look up like Huli Data Eng Pipelines, you can check it out. It's a good reference implementation of how you might implement Dagster on GitHub. But, if your goal is to get people to visualize themselves using something, you want to give them something that it feels like they kind of can picture themselves actually in the product. They can picture their use cases. And so, there's a lot of like things where you're like, oh, my specific API or my specific integration is going to do a bunch of stuff that, is weird or is different or is whatever. And so in those contexts, you really want something that helps them see that like Dagster can help them with their specific problems. And a custom demo is a big way to do that, because it kind of gives you that like, okay, I can actually see how Dagster would integrate with my legacy stack. So say like, I'm using IBM Data Stage, or I'm using Informatica Cloud or Informatica Power Center, which, maybe is end of life or whatever, and I need to get off of it. Or I'm using, some other tool. I'm using Alteryx and I'm hoping to get off it, or whatever the case may be. Or maybe I'm not trying to get off of it, but I need to be able to monitor and observe everything in my data estate, everything in my data platform. So I need to be able to like understand what's happening over in Alteryx or over, you know, in Domo. But then I also need to be able to build off in DBT and DLT and do this other thing, this other team or other group, right? And so with a, you know, it's not reasonable. There's such a long tail in data engineering that like we couldn't build all of that into one standard demo and kind of show everything, because that would be very overwhelming. So instead, we can figure out based on initial conversations what technology stack and core set of problems people are trying to solve, and then we can, you know, be able to show them that in a real way that captures the actual problems they're trying to solve, and then shows them how Dagster can actually meet them where they're going. The other thing to call out is this all works. The thing that we're going to talk about with respect to using Gen AI, using LLMs to actually build these custom demos, and frankly to build Dagster projects in general. This all works because Dagster is AI native. And what I mean by that, because it's like a buzzy thing to say, right? Basically, it's that we have an amazing CLI that allows you to scaffold, build, validate, and deploy your changes. So it has everything that you need from that perspective of building and running things locally. We also have, I kind of jumped to number 2. We also have an amazing developer experience. So we have intuitive APIs, and by intuitive APIs I mean we are a declarative data we have our declarative data platform. So everything in Dagster is declarative based on like the thing you're trying to do. So you want to do a backfill, you click on a button that says backfill, right? Or you have parameters in your APIs that talk about backfills and incremental models and partitions. We have asset checks and data quality baked into the platform. We have all of these things that are, and we call them like asset checks, or we call them, data assets. And the terms that we're using match the terms that downstream stakeholders are thinking about, also match terms that like, data engineers are thinking about, analytics engineers, whatever, and match things that like agents find easy to reason about, because they're all kind of using the same mental model, right? So we're kind of able to import that mental model and allow those AI systems to build, and then engineers can double check and see, I see what you're doing, because I can kind of follow the train of thought here of like why you chose to build this the way that you chose to build it. The other thing, we've got deep integrations with integrations that people care about. And so, here we've got, we've got great support for DBT, Snowflake, Databricks, just like the broader data ecosystem, whatever the case may be. And so that's just a good example where, it's with a couple of lines of YAML, you're able to, which is using our components, you're able to like connect to a DBT project and just model all of that as Dagster assets or things like that. And that's true for a whole host of integrations that are extremely straightforward to work with. Okay, so, Dagster itself is great for building with generative AI, with LLMs. What about like, what was our process? Like, what does it look like? And I put this here because I just feel like, I don't know, everybody is at one, everybody feels like they're behind. 2, everybody is like, kind of nobody really everyone talks about building with AI, but then like what are people actually doing is not always, doesn't feel like it's always out there. So this is what we did. The very first thing we did, so back in July, we started with a custom prompt that was in a Claude command, if you remember those, which is basically a markdown file in the commands directory that was invoked, not involved, inside of a Python script. And so basically, the idea there, I think, when our engineers built this out, was as a little proof of concept, was like, hey, all of us are really comfortable running Python scripts. We don't feel like we're not as comfortable with, say, Claude Code. So isn't it great if we could just like run a Python script that would actually do the thing? And so that's basically was a Python script that you would add the prompt to, and then it would invoke the command and do the thing. And it had some other little niceties in there too, but in general, that was kind of what we did. Then, of course, skills came out. And so then I took it upon myself to rewrite all of that using skills, which at the time, I didn't notice a lot of improvement. So just to back up, like in case anybody, isn't fully aware on the skills bandwagon, skills are a thing that at first Anthropic launched and now is pretty much a regular staple in agentic engineering, which is a way of doing progressive disclosure because what you find is, as you add more and more commands, as you add more and more things to your, Claude MD or your agents.md, is that the context window gets really clogged up of like all of the stuff that's in your context, even before you do anything, which is bad for two reasons. One, it uses a bunch of input tokens, and two, it degrades the performance of the overall thing. So it's basically just all bad. So what skills allow you to do is to say, okay, well, only load this skill using a description. So the only thing that gets loaded in the context are like the descriptions of the inside of the skill, and then the actual body of the skill doesn't get loaded at all until like it's needed. Now, in the initial version I did, that was kind of not really helped because I basically converted everything into skills that were still running sort of like a workflow. So, lessons learned. So it was still not really the big benefit, but it did kind of get us in the direction of using skills at least, which I think set us up well, because then in January of this year, some of the Dagster engineers launched the Dagster skills, which you can find at dagster.io/skills, which are using skills best practices. So one of the key features is that like even within a skill, say like Dagster expert, there's still progressive disclosure within that skill. So even though I'm invoking Dagster expert, there's like a references table, and like you can take a look at our skill and see what I'm talking about, because it's all just markdown. But you can see there's like a references table that says like if someone asks about DBT, go read this into context. If someone asks about DLT, go read this into context, and so on and so forth, right? Someone asks about declarative automation, like read this into context. And that's really powerful, because what it means is, even though I'm invoking the same skill, like I don't have to know as a user like which skill I'm going to invoke. I just invoke Dagster expert, and then boom, you get all of the right skills loaded in just the skills that you need, or just the parts of the skill you need loaded in it, like kind of using that progressive disclosure construct. So really helpful overall. And so that was kind of what we started in January, and then over time I basically deprecated the old set of skills I was using. And migrated to using only this plus a which we'll talk about in a second, plus like a demo, Dagster demo skills repo, which, because there's certain things that like I prefer, and kind of as SEs we want to put in that like you wouldn't want to do as a general recommendation. So for example, in every single demo, I create a demo mode, which is basically like, because I want to have a production implementation and a demo implementation. The demo implementation I can like show off, but the production code is right there in the same places, in the same code paths. That's really useful. When you're demoing, that's not so useful, just like in general. Most people don't care about that. So that's like a skill where like I have a custom skill that will tell Claude Code how to do that. Also like one that consolidates definitions. That one might be like slightly more general purpose, but it's still like, so just like in Dagster, when you create components, which are like, it's our YAML DSL to create Dagster definitions and like assets, schedules, sensors, whatever. The default is to do one YAML file per component instance, but there's ways of combining them. And I found it's much more readable and nice to look at them like kind of, in logical groupings. And so I have that skill that will kind of do that for me, so that I can sort of have things put together in a way that makes sense. So let's see. Okay, so we are at the live demo phase, but I don't know that it's completed, but that's fine. I'm gonna let's see. Before we get there, any questions before I show the actual results? And in the meantime, I'll share my terminal so you can actually see what's churning. But before we share the live result of our little demo, any questions, anything that y'all want to know based on the stuff that we talked about so far? Yeah, sure, totally. You can get the prompt. So my prompt was, hold on, let me share my terminal and then I'll put that in there. Cool. Okay, so this is the prompt. I will put this in here. So you can check that out. You can take that and give it a go. The other skill spot for skills, if you want to like literally follow along, there's just this Dagster demo skills. and this Dagster expert skills. These are the only skills I'm using, and there's just that prompt. So I don't need to put, I don't actually use the CloudMD for this. I just, because I'm using the keyword demo Dagster project, and because this guy here is looking for, basically if I look at this, just to kind of highlight what I'm talking about. Oh, sorry. I'm not sharing, forgetting I'm not sharing the right thing. Just to show you like what I'm talking about. So like here, for example, this is like the Dagster demo skill. You can see here, basically I say, hey, always use the Dagster expert skill. Like don't go off and do your own thing. But basically it's saying, hey, you're going to build and modify the Dagster demo components. So this will get triggered pretty much every time I say, make me a Dagster demo. If I wanted to, I could invoke that, via like, let me just go back to the terminal really quick. Cool. So if I wanted to, I could like, I could do like slash, Dagster demo or slash Dagster expert as a way of like ensuring that that skill got loaded. That's fine too. That'll totally work. But yeah, that's, that is that. And then just to, while this is still going, I will show you the other prompt that I actually did successfully implement. So here you'll see this is like a relatively similar prompt. So I basically said create a Dagster demo project that ingests data from Fivetran, uses DBT for data ingestion, high touch reverse ETL. I'm also going to migrate from Informatica Cloud. So like give me an example of that stuff. And so while this is churning, because it's like it's doing a lot of like validation that like the partition logic and all of that is like what it would expect. So I suspect it'll probably finish within the next like 5 minutes. Yeah. So then let me just share my a VS Code session that has that existing demo stood up. Let me pull this guy up, and I'll share some code, and then we can talk about it. Here we go. So this is what was generated from this previous example that I did yesterday. So you'll see here, like in this case, like if I go here, you'll see like what it generated in terms of the components, like the Python. You'll see here, it'll have things like, let me just go to the DBT example or like one of these to show you. So like it'll show you like in this case, like it's gonna say subclass, like it's gonna use the Fivetran account component, but it's gonna like override it with a demo version that also allows me to set a demo mode of true. So that's like another really nice thing about the way that our components are set up is they can be subclassed and you can extend them however you want to, which I find really helpful, not just for demos, but just like if you want to, add a functionality to something, you can do so without necessarily like you can do so without like basically forking the existing repo, right? So here's like an example. So I've got like my Fivetran assets. I've got my like DBT assets with some asset checks. I've got my high touch syncs, loading into Salesforce and things like that. And then also up here, I just want to call out like this is really neat because what this is doing, and I'll turn on the automations here. So what this is doing is showing you that like I can actually set up something inside of Dagster that's like monitoring an external process. So like here's examples of like these are called external assets. I can't materialize these, but maybe I want to like monitor external systems like Informatica or something else. I can actually do that inside of Dagster in a really neat way. So this is a way where I can like kind of show how that works with like a sensor that, in demo mode will mark these as materialized, and in production mode, it would actually like hit the Informatica Cloud REST API and do all that kind of stuff. And then scrolling down, I also have an example here of like an Informatica asset where I could actually materialize it. So maybe you want to have something that is materializable. You could follow the same pattern. I could do that too. So like, and here you'll see it since I turned the schedule on. Now this guy's running and is going to get materialized. And so with, even with legacy systems, you can follow both patterns. And again, all that was just to, create this was a prompt that just said, like basically make an Informatica Cloud component, or make an Informatica Cloud integration that both observes and executes, right? Shows me how I can do both. And so here I can kind of see how I could do both, all from this place here. Just to show you a little bit about like what these components look like. So here you'll see like, here's a high touch component, here's the attributes that would define the high touch component. Here's the attributes that would define, like a different high touch component, for example. Or if I go to like, say, Informatica, you'll see here, like I've got attributes of like, what is the URL, what's the username and password, or the credentials, all that kind of stuff. And so, and then here's my modern pipeline with like, data from Fivetran and then data from DBT. So really like, and this is all like, in one sense, this is demo because there's like, stub assets that I'm actually executing on my local machine. But this is also pretty actually surprisingly close to real executable code. And what I mean by that is like, I can take this and I can, like in one case I did for a prospect, I built out using this exact same setup. I built out a prompt to generate and observe IBM data stage, which is in some ways very similar to like, say, Informatica Cloud or things like that. And I was able to generate that and share it. And I had no access to a data stage instance, so I couldn't like validate anything. But because the documentation for data stage is in the world as like CLI docs and API docs, the Claude Code and these models are able to use that to then like generate all of these things. And so that is pretty cool. We got to the step where it's now generating asset checks, and then it's going to verify everything. So let me pull this up, and yeah, I'll just pause there again and just see like any follow-ups, questions, comments. Colton, anything from the chat we should call out?
Oh, I got pulled on stage. There were no like specific questions to the demo itself. I am curious to get your input as well, Christian, about loop engineering. Akash asked about my thought on that, and I gave my opinion, but I'm curious if you have any insights too before I reveal what I said.
Oh, yeah, so like, I think that this stuff is moving very fast, and I think you should take seriously what the people at like Frontier Labs are saying, but I also think you should take it with a time horizon and a giant grain of salt. So like all of the people talking about loops are using like Fable or like 5.6 Sol. And are you using Fable every day to do all of your things? Like probably not. And so, I think it is exciting or interesting to think about, but I also think you just have to think about like, and like also like, what do people mean by that? They kind of just mean like automation. Like I think that if you did like, I think the word loop is a bad word. I don't think people should say it. And like, you can come after me for that, but it's fine. I think I've heard someone say we should use the word automations. I love that idea because that's what it is. It's basically just like for the most part, like when you see like, folks talking about loops, what they're talking about is like, I want to do this thing. I want to do it on a schedule, or I want it to happen asynchronously and then come back to me when I need to give feedback. But like, I want you to go triage Jira or triage Linear and like, then, or whatever. And then tell me when there's stuff I should care about. Right. And whatever. I think that's like really valuable, but also one, do you have the tokens for that? Not everybody has the tokens for that, which is fine. I don't think like, like if you're not working at a Frontier Lab, that's fine. And two, like, just, yeah, I don't know. I think like, do you have those use cases? But anyway, what do you think, Colton?
Yeah, I agree. I think I really see a lot of potential in things like Hermes or CloudBot, like the long running harnesses essentially. But I think like running it yourself in a loop on your machine with your own like tooling around it is pretty limited. And I also think that there's a lot of potential too with like Claude when they added workflows within Claude itself, where it would essentially create a DAG of tasks to complete, and it could run much longer that way. But I think like little like self made loops around it aren't necessarily the solution. There was another question here from Stephen that I can read out loud, Christian, and he said,
Sure.
would it be relevant here to demo iterations for the post-ETL downstream steps too, or is that out of scope for today? Semantic context layer, like describe each column, data quality test, reporting with evidence.dev, etc. What do you think? Is that out of scope for this one?
Well, so we can talk about because it's just finishing right now. We can talk about the like data quality stuff. We have an evidence dev integration. So if I had just asked it to do something with evidence.dev, that would also, it would like be able to create that and be able to visualize it. So you could definitely do that. And and we do also have examples on our doc site. We have like a great a page called like best practice, or like we have an examples page which has a combination of full pipelines and best practices, kind of like mini pipelines or mini examples. And we've got some great examples of like using LLMs in those contexts. So that's another place that I would kind of steer you on that front. And again, we got evidence.dev, I believe, is a community integration. Is that right,
It
Colton?
is. Yep.
So yeah, that's there. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, let me share my screen again, and we will see what happened. Let's see. Okay, so here we go. It's now verifying. So it's going through it's going through like its final validation here. But I just here this is the demo that's in progress. That's pretty close to fully baked. I'm gonna boot that up in VS Code so we can just take a look at what happened. And again, part of the reason I thought it would be useful to just do this kind of thing live is because I think it is surprising both how fast and how solid the results are. So like you saw, like I was vamping with you all. I didn't have time to like tweak any of this stuff or like tell you, oh, like here's, you're doing it all wrong, start over. I did none of that. It basically just, it did all of this on its own using the skill and using everything else. So everything you see here in this project, from like these data quality checks, which it looks like it implemented in as just like straight Python asset checks. So this is, okay, let's see what it did. Okay, so here we've got some asset checks to make sure there's no like duplicate IDs. It's like executing a query to do that, and then it's passing the results, to make sure that like the duplicate count is 0. That looks quite reasonable. And then it's making sure that the row count of the export snapshot matches the mart, like where it's coming from. So that also sounds pretty reasonable. I'm sure like if I looked at this, there's probably some things I would be like, oh, we should do this a little bit differently, or there might be tweaks or things like that. But if your goal is to kind of see like how could this work, or what would this look like, here I've got I'm pulling from like some billing data from like using DLT. With the DLT pipeline. I've got a sensor here to kind of do things in a more like reactive way, or be more proactive. I mean, about like kicking things off when certain assets are built. And then here's all of the different components. And again, components, these are like the Python definitions for those YAML DSL interfaces. So this is like the code that allows you to do these different things. And so here I've got, again, goes back to like the demo piece. It's got like some things about like invoices or, other things like that. And then I'm going to build a component that's actually going to like go off and do something with that and build like a DLT pipeline. So this is just like a thin wrapper around a DLT pipeline, basically. And so, yeah. And then like, we got Stitch. So here we've got a minimal Stitch client that was implemented. And so, for all of our Stitch stands out there, so here we go. We've got like, what you're going to look for. It's going to, basically query the thing and go from there. And then it's defining like a run and poll to kind of like, these are methods that are going to get used inside of this Stitch component. And so here, this Stitch component is actually going to use those things, going to like parse the stream and, all of this kind of stuff. And so this is some code. I can push this code up to GitHub. And so if you care and are interested in taking a look at this, you are more than welcome to. And let's see, we've got our Parquet file. So this thing's going to like write data to Parquet, from the warehouse. And then as you can see up here, this is where it actually ended up. So there is the Parquet file, and that's partitioned by today, and all of that kind of thing. And so yeah, let me just run dgdev. And again, this is like the other piece of this is like I can just run like dgdev right on this repo, and I can be off to the races, right? So it's already installed, like part of the whole setup here. It installed the virtual environment. It built all of the Python dependencies. It did all the stuff. So this is like an isolated Python environment, all of the things that, people know and love. And so this is like a way where I can kick this stuff off. And let's see. I didn't actually check to see if it was like done. Yeah, okay, it's right in a README. So it looks like it is now satisfied that it completed its work. So this is gonna launch some Dagster services. And kick off, and then once then we'll look at the UI, and then we will pause there. Of course, let's see. There we go. All right. So let's see. So under automation, we've got like jobs on a schedule. We've got some sensors, and so you can kind of see this is an asset sensor that's going to look to see that's going to run this health export job when this mark customer health is materialized, which is that monitored asset. Over here, we've got some other jobs that are on a schedule. And then we've got this sensor here that's like checking Informatica Cloud to see, similar to what we talked about before. And so let's take a look at the lineage here. We've got we've got some like invoices getting adjusted from DLT. We've got these different Stitch integrations against a complex API. You will notice when I zoom in that these are all partitioned by day. And so this is, again, like where that logic was implemented and kind of, all there. And so you can see that. Well, let's see what else. We've got our DBT project that sits downstream of all this. It's got asset checks associated with it, some of which are DBT asset checks, some of which are not. And so you'll see kind of all of that pulled in as well. And then what else? What else did we do? I think that was more or less it. So yeah, Stitch, DLT, DBT, an export using like Parquet, so like writing data out to Parquet. And we've got that custom asset check here that is checking to make sure that the number of rows in Marts matches the number of models in source. And then I can just I could run all these if I wanted to. So let me just go ahead and do that, and we'll kick it off. No, fine. I'll make sure those are targeted too. Cool. And I will target the most recent partition, and I'm going to launch it. And so this is going to run. Cool. Well, thanks y'all for bearing with me or working with me while we launch this, this Dagster platform. And yeah, this is let's pause there and see any other follow-up questions. Anything else anybody has on their mind?
So as we're waiting for questions to come in, I did have one of, this was pretty much one-shotted. How much do you tweak these before presenting them?
It depends a little bit on how, maybe how, critical the thing is. And so sometimes, if I know that it is very important that people are going to see and understand this, that's, then I'll put in like lots of extra effort, obviously, like depending on the strategic nature of the account or things like that. But in general, it's usually one-shotting, and then occasionally I'll see something that could be better, or often where like I'll reprompt is like I'll know that they really care about like anomaly detection, or I'll know that this prospect really cares about some aspect of data quality. And so yeah, that's really where I go. And just to answer David's question, I actually don't like. I use the Dagster expert skill and that Dagster demo skill that I showed, and that's it. And so I'll put those two, or like I think we already put those in the chat. I think
Yeah.
we might have. Yeah. So but that's literally it. So the only skills that are getting invoked are those two. And so you could do this exact thing that I did, and I think you would get very similar results. Obviously, I can't guarantee. LLMs do what they will, but in general, I found, and like I've also done experiments, because sometimes, like, Claude is smart, or like these LMs are smart, and like harnesses are smart, and like so as I've built up a repository of demos, they will use those demos as background for like building future things, which is great for me, but bad if I'm telling you, hey, this is really successful, and then actually what it's doing is just bootstrapping the knowledge I've built up and the skill. So I've actually done some hard resets where I've like blown away all the demos and started from scratch, just to basically be like, is this real? Like, is there stuff that I've done that, like, is kind of is not working, or is like is changing, because these things are so non-deterministic. Is it going to like change the output? But really, all you have to do is install Dagster Expert, and that if you want to straight up do what I was doing here, you would just do the Dagster demo skills. That's it.
Yeah, and I'd like to call out that I've found that these LLMs work exceptionally well when they have access to these systems you're working with. So if it had like read-only access to your Postgres database that you're replicating, or read-only Snowflake access, or write access if you're bold or in a dev environment, then it can actually iterate much, much better when it's developing these pipelines. And then also within DG, like our DG CLI, we have a lot of tools for validating that definitions are correct, and that you can like materialize an asset and see the results. So I found that I can get Claude to run for a very long time if I give it access to the systems I want to replicate, then give it more detailed, like real world instructions on what I want it to build, and then tell it to validate its work using the DG CLI afterwards. That way, it kind of like cuts out the need for a human to go and like run DG dev, click materialize, make sure it's working. You can actually go through that process and then just give you the end result that's already been validated. And a lot of those concepts are baked into the Dagster expert skill itself. So it'll know how to validate things using the DG CLI, and also write unit tests for your pipelines.
Yeah, still waiting for some other questions to come in, so I'll take the opportunity and ask one more. So do customers ever ask for the code that's produced during the demos, or ask for your prompt or anything, or kind of where do they take it after seeing all this?
Sometimes. So I think one example, I mentioned that IBM Data Stage 1, I handed that off to them and they were able to run it successfully. And then they basically were able to dramatically speed up. So in that context, and this is like really common, right? Which is like, in that context, they were working on migrating away from Data Stage, but like, and this is true in a lot of cases. When you're in the middle of a migration, it's like the most vulnerable time, because you basically you're doing like, you're maintaining an old system and you're building a new system, and you need to keep track of both. And often you're on call for both. And often like the legacy system is the more important one for your stakeholders, because that's where all like the meaty stuff that they care about is. And then like but then you care about building the new system, because that's what you're trying to get to. And so by, we were able to accelerate the migration by starting like the ability to observe and monitor data stage on like day one within Dagster, and then also be able to build with the new tools they wanted to use, and combining those two things together, which is like really powerful. Which we actually have a great example of, like, based on some of that work on like IBM Data Stage. We actually have like a full pipeline example of that, which I think is pretty cool to see, like how you can model and monitor like what you would think of as maybe a legacy system, or maybe one that you want to migrate away from inside of Dagster. Great question. I love this question. Okay, so Sharif basically says, what about other platforms, right? I'm using Cloud Code. I'm using, in this case, Sonnet 5. I've used, just so to put the cards on the table, I mostly use Anthropic models for most of my work. I know like other folks, like I think Colton is like typically a Codex person and has good results. So like, you know, I know that we use both. And then we've had good success. In terms of other harnesses, I've actually tested Copilot. I tested this like maybe 6 months ago. So like, you know, I don't do like a rigorous, like I don't try to check every harness every time. But I did basically, I had this like, you know, moment of crisis one day when I was like, well, this team I'm working with is using Copilot. Is everything I'm telling them garbage because I'm doing Claude Code and they're doing Copilot, and like, will it even work? So I basically just did it twice. I did like a full test using Claude Code. Then I did the exact same test using Copilot. And I found that the results were roughly similar. The main distinction was that Copilot churned a little bit more. So it made at least, you know, this is not a formal evaluation, but it seemed to make more mistakes. And then it corrected those mistakes, but it took a little longer. So that's what I've tested. And I found it to be pretty good across the harnesses that I've tested these things on. Yeah, and great point, Colton, in the chat. Oh, sweet. And we got a good example of somebody doing this.
Cool. Also, this recording will be uploaded to our YouTube here shortly if you wanted to share this one with any of your coworkers or just watch it back.
Yeah, but if there's no other questions, happy to just end on a compliment. So yeah, thank you all for attending. And yeah, thank you, Christian and Colton. I thought that it's really great to just be able to do something end to end in 30, 40 minutes.
Yeah, that was awesome. Great job, Christian.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.